You're being detained. I've already told you why.
You said you smelled drugs. I'm asking how you determined that.
Sir, step out of the vehicle. I smell narcotics.
My hands are visible. I'm not refusing. I just need you to explain why you're detaining me.
I'm asking you one more time to step out of the vehicle. There was no shouting. The words were delivered evenly, as if they had been rehearsed. The officer stood just behind the driver's door, one hand resting near his belt, the other holding a flashlight that wasn't necessary in the afternoon light. "I'm not refusing," the man inside the car said. His voice was low, careful. "I'm asking why." "You're being detained because I smell narcotics," the officer replied. "That's probable cause." There was a pause. The engine was still running. A turn signal clicked. Forgotten. The man kept both hands on the steering wheel, fingers spread, visible through the open window. "I don't have anything illegal in the car," he said. "And I don't consent to a search." "That's not your call right now," the officer answered. His tone hardened slightly, not louder, just firmer. "Step out of the vehicle." "I'd like to understand what's happening before I do that," the man said. "Am I under arrest?" "You will be if you keep arguing," the officer said. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You fit the profile. You're nervous. And I smell drugs." Another pause. The man looked straight ahead, not at the officer, not at the camera clipped to his chest. Traffic moved past them in slow, indifferent waves. "I'm calm," the man said. "My hands are visible. I haven't made any sudden movements." The officer exhaled through his nose, a short breath that sounded like restraint. "I don't need a speech," he said. "I need compliance." A second patrol car rolled up behind them, tires crunching on gravel. The officer didn't acknowledge it. His attention stayed fixed on the man in the driver's seat. "This doesn't need to get complicated," the officer said. "Open the door. Now." The man swallowed once. "I'm trying to keep it from becoming complicated," he said. "That's why I'm asking questions." The officer straightened, hand brushing the radio on his shoulder. "Last chance," he said. The stop had taken place on a wide service road that paralleled the highway, a stretch of asphalt used mostly by delivery trucks and commuters avoiding traffic. It was mid-afternoon, the sun high enough to flatten shadows and make everything feel exposed. There was no urgency in the environment. No flashing hazards from other cars. No crowd. Just the slow hiss of vehicles passing a few lanes away. The officer had initiated the stop less than 2 minutes earlier. No sirens. Just lights, briefly, and a hand motion directing the car to pull over. It had been clean and efficient, the kind of stop that suggested routine rather than suspicion. The officer moved with practiced confidence, steps measured, posture upright. This was familiar territory. He had done this hundreds of times. The man in the driver's seat complied immediately. He signaled, slowed, and eased the car onto the shoulder without hesitation. The window came down before the officer reached the door. His hands went to the steering wheel, not because he was told to, but because it was what people did when they wanted to show they understood the rules of the encounter. There was no smell of burnt rubber or alcohol. No loud music. No visible clutter in the car. The interior looked orderly, almost sparse. A jacket folded on the passenger seat. A phone resting face down in the center console. Nothing that suggested chaos or haste. The officer began the interaction the way he always did. License, registration, insurance. His voice was neutral, procedural, carrying the weight of authority without raising volume. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The uniform did that work for him. The man answered politely. He moved slowly when asked to retrieve his documents, narrating his actions as he did so. He didn't argue. He didn't challenge the stop. When the officer took the documents and stepped back toward his patrol car, the man waited, eyes forward, engine still idling. Time stretched in small increments. 30 seconds. A minute. The officer returned, not with a citation, but with questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? The questions were casual on the surface, but their rhythm was familiar. They weren't about traffic anymore. The man answered each one plainly. Short responses. No embellishment. He didn't ask why he was being asked. He didn't joke. He didn't bristle. His tone stayed even, almost deliberately so. It was then that the officer mentioned the smell. He didn't frame it as a possibility. He stated it as fact. The words came out calmly, as if they were simply another box being checked. The implication followed naturally. The encounter had shifted. What had begun as a traffic stop was now something else. The man's posture changed, but only slightly. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His hands didn't leave the wheel. He didn't laugh it off or protest loudly. He asked a single question, carefully phrased, about what that meant for him. The officer's confidence didn't waver. He explained procedure, detention, investigation. He spoke the language fluently, comfortably. This was his environment, his system. The road, the uniform, the authority to decide when a situation escalated. A second patrol car arrived and parked behind the first, angled just enough to signal support. The presence was subtle but unmistakable. The balance of power was now clearly visible, even if no one said it out loud. The man noticed. He glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, then returned his gaze forward. His voice, when he spoke again, was still calm. He said he wanted to understand his rights. The officer heard that not as a request, but as resistance. And from that moment on, the encounter stopped moving forward. It began circling instead, tightening slowly, driven not by urgency, but by certainty. The officer repeated his instruction without changing his volume. Step out of the vehicle. The words landed flat, practiced, stripped of emotion. He stood in the same place, feet planted, shoulders squared, waiting for compliance rather than conversation. The man did not move. He did not grip the wheel tighter. He did not sigh or shake his head. He stayed exactly as he was. "I'm not refusing," he said again. "I'm asking what legal basis you're using to order me out." The officer's jaw shifted slightly. He looked back toward the second patrol car, then forward again. "I already told you," he said. "I smell narcotics. That gives me probable cause." "I understand that's what you're saying," the man replied. "I'm asking how you determined that." The officer didn't answer the question. He repeated the instruction. "Step out of the vehicle." Seconds passed. The radio on his shoulder crackled with unrelated traffic. Somewhere down the road, a truck downshifted loudly. None of it seemed to register. "I'm going to stay where I am until I understand what's happening," the man said. His voice was measured, almost formal. "I'm not threatening you. I'm not trying to leave." The officer shifted his weight. "You don't get to dictate the stop," he said. "You get to comply." A pause followed, long enough to feel intentional. The man inhaled slowly. "Am I being detained?" he asked. "Or am I under arrest?" "You're being detained," the officer replied, "which means you need to do what I'm telling you to do." "For how long?" the man asked. The officer exhaled again, sharper this time. "As long as it takes." The loop began there. Each time the man asked for clarification, the officer restated his authority. Each time the officer gave an order, the man responded with a calm assertion of his rights. Neither raised his voice. Neither stepped closer. The distance between them stayed fixed, but the tension thickened in the space between words. The officer gestured toward the door. "Open it." "I will," the man said, "if you explain why that's necessary." "I don't need to explain it," the officer said. "I've already done that." "You stated a conclusion," the man replied. "I'm asking for the reasoning." The officer turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the road. A third vehicle slowed as it passed, the driver glancing over before continuing on. The officer seemed to notice. "Sir," he said, adding the word as if it were a courtesy he didn't feel obligated to provide. "This is turning into a bigger problem than it needs to be." "I'm trying to keep it from becoming one," the man answered. The officer's hand rested closer to his belt now. Not touching, just nearer. A signal without a statement. "You're making this harder on yourself," the officer said. The man nodded once, slowly. I'm aware that's how it feels to you. That response drew a brief silence. The officer looked at him more directly then, as if reassessing. The calm wasn't fading. The posture wasn't changing. There was no visible fear, no aggression, just steadiness. Do you have anything illegal in the car? The officer asked. No, the man said. Any weapons? The officer asked. No. Then you shouldn't have a problem stepping out, the officer concluded. I don't have a problem, the man replied. I have a question. The officer turned slightly toward the second patrol car and spoke quietly into his radio. The words weren't fully audible, but the tone suggested impatience rather than alarm. When he turned back, his expression had tightened. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to step out. We're going to do a quick search. And then you're going to be on your way if there's nothing there. I don't consent to a search, the man said. I'm not asking for consent, the officer replied. Another car slowed as it passed. Then another. The shoulder no longer felt empty. The officer noticed the attention now, even if he pretended not to. His voice stayed controlled, but his sentences shortened. Open the door, he said. I'd like a supervisor, the man said. That was the first time the officer paused before responding. A supervisor isn't necessary, he said. This is a simple stop. If it's simple, the man replied, then having a supervisor shouldn't complicate it. The officer looked at the second patrol car again. The other officer remained inside, watching but not intervening. The silence stretched. You're not in a position to make demands, the first officer said finally. I'm making a request, the man answered. The officer's lips pressed together briefly. He spoke into his radio again, this time more clearly. A request for a supervisor, phrased as an update rather than a concession. While they waited, the loop tightened further. The officer asked the same questions again. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? The man answered the same way he had before. The answers did not change. The tone did not change. You seem very composed for someone in this situation, the officer said. I'm focused on following the law, the man replied. The officer nodded once, as if that confirmed something to him rather than challenged it. You're being uncooperative, he said. I'm being careful, the man answered. The distinction hung there, unresolved. Minutes passed. The supervisor had not arrived yet. The officer filled the time with repetition. Each instruction sounded more final than the last, though nothing actually progressed. Last warning, he said at one point, though there had already been several. What happens after that? The man asked. You don't want to find out, the officer replied. The man nodded again. I'd rather know. The officer turned away briefly, pacing 2 steps toward his patrol car, then back again. His movements were controlled but no longer relaxed. The calm certainty he'd started with was being replaced by something tighter, something reactive. A small group of people had begun to gather farther down the shoulder. Not a crowd, just witnesses. Drivers who had pulled over for unrelated reasons. A cyclist who had stopped. No one said anything. They watched quietly. The officer noticed them. His shoulders squared more firmly. Step out of the vehicle, he said again, louder now, though still not shouting. I'm going to stay seated, the man said, until a supervisor arrives. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. You're obstructing an investigation, he said. I'm exercising my rights, the man replied. The radio crackled again. The supervisor was en route. The officer nodded to himself, as if reassured by that. Fine, he said. We'll do it that way. But the tone had shifted. The patience was gone. The certainty was fraying at the edges. While they waited, the officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You know, he said, people who act like this usually have something to hide. The man met his gaze for the first time. Not defiantly, not challengingly, just directly. Sometimes, he said, people act like this because they know how these situations tend to go. The officer straightened. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The process was already in motion. The supervisor's car appeared in the distance. lights flashing briefly before turning off as it pulled in behind the others. The officer felt it before he saw it, a subtle shift in the balance of the scene. But nothing resolved yet. No orders were rescinded. No apologies offered. The loop had done its work. By the time the supervisor stepped out of his vehicle, the stop had become something else entirely. Not an investigation anymore. A test of authority, of restraint, of what happened when procedure met someone who understood it just as well. And still, no one had revealed who the man in the driver's seat actually was. The supervisor approached without urgency. His pace was unhurried, his expression neutral, as if he were walking into a routine conversation rather than a prolonged standoff. He listened as the officer summarized the situation, nodding occasionally, eyes shifting between the patrol car, the driver's seat, and the small cluster of onlookers farther down the shoulder. When the officer finished, the supervisor stepped closer to the window. "Sir," he said, "I'm the shift supervisor. Can you tell me why you're refusing to step out of the vehicle?" The man answered without raising his voice. "I haven't refused," he said. "I asked for clarification. I was told I smell like narcotics. I'm asking how that determination was made." The supervisor glanced briefly at the first officer, then back at the man. "Do you have anything illegal in the car?" he asked. "No," the man said. The supervisor nodded slowly. "Then this should be simple. Step out so we can clear this up." The man paused, just long enough to signal that he was choosing his words carefully. "Before I do that," he said, "I need to make you aware of something." The supervisor waited. "I'm a federal agent," the man said. "I work for the Drug Enforcement Administration." The words were delivered plainly. No emphasis, no challenge, as if he were stating his address or occupation on a form. The supervisor's expression didn't change. He looked at the man for a moment, then turned his head slightly toward the first officer. "Did he just say he's DA?" he asked. "That's what he said," the officer replied, his tone dismissive. The supervisor turned back to the man. "Do you have credentials to support that?" he asked. "Yes," the man said. "They're in my wallet." "Then why didn't you say that earlier?" the officer interjected. "Because it shouldn't be necessary," the man replied. "I haven't done anything wrong." The supervisor exhaled slowly. "People say a lot of things when they're trying to get out of a search," he said. "Being a federal agent doesn't exempt you from a lawful stop." "I'm aware of that," the man said. "I'm not asking for special treatment." The supervisor studied him again. The calm hadn't cracked. The posture hadn't shifted. If anything, the tension had increased. "All right," the supervisor said finally. "We'll verify it." There was no apology. No acknowledgement that the encounter might have taken a wrong turn. The process, instead of ending, had just begun. Verification did not happen quickly. It never does. The supervisor asked the man to keep his hands visible while he retrieved his wallet. The instruction was delivered carefully now, with qualifiers added where there had been none before. Slowly, deliberately, the man did exactly what he was told. He handed over a credential holder without commentary. The supervisor opened it and looked down. His eyes moved once, then again, slower the second time. He did not react outwardly. He closed it and handed it back. "I'm going to need to confirm this," he said. "Of course," the man replied. The supervisor stepped away and keyed his radio. He spoke quietly, using codes rather than names. The first officer stood nearby, arms folded now, watching but no longer directing. The second patrol car remained silent, its presence suddenly less supportive and more observational. Minutes passed. The supervisor paced a short distance, phone now in hand. He spoke again, this time turning his body away from the scene, voice lowered further. The wind carried fragments of conversation, but not enough to form sentences. The first officer shifted his stance. He adjusted his belt. He glanced toward the onlookers, then away. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. The supervisor returned. Expression changed just enough to be noticeable. Not alarmed. Not apologetic. Just altered. "Sir," he said to the man, "can you confirm your assignment location?" The man answered. "And your supervisor's name?" The man answered again. The supervisor nodded, writing nothing down, committing everything to memory instead. Another call. Another pause. The officer who had initiated the stop stood a few feet back now, no longer the center of the interaction. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter. "So you're saying you're DEA?" he said. "That's what I said earlier," the man replied. The supervisor looked at the officer, not sharply, but with a stillness that carried weight. "We're waiting on confirmation," he said. When it came, it did not arrive dramatically. There was no raised voice on the phone, no sudden shift in posture, just a brief nod from the supervisor, followed by silence. He ended the call and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. "All right," he said finally. "That checks out." No one responded. The officer's face tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to calculation. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would help him. The supervisor cleared his throat. "You're free to go," he said to the man. "You're not under arrest. You were never under arrest." "I understand," the man replied. No apology followed. None was offered. The paperwork began instead. The supervisor asked the officer to step aside. Their conversation was quiet, but the body language was unmistakable. The officer's shoulders were no longer squared. His hands no longer rested comfortably at his sides. He nodded more than he spoke. The onlookers began to disperse. The moment had passed for them. The tension drained out of the air slowly, leaving behind only procedure and consequence. The man started his car. Before pulling away, he looked once at the supervisor. "I'd like the case number," he said. The supervisor hesitated, then nodded. "You'll have it," he said. As the car merged back into traffic, the officer remained on the shoulder, watching it go. His authority had not been challenged loudly. It had simply been examined, and it had not held up well under that examination. Consequences did not arrive that afternoon. They never do. What arrived instead was documentation. Within 48 hours, the body-worn camera footage was logged, flagged, and requested by multiple departments. What had initially been categorized as a routine traffic stop was reclassified internally as a prolonged detention with probable cause disputed by the subject. That reclassification alone triggered mandatory review. The officer was placed on administrative duty pending investigation. His badge and service weapon were surrendered temporarily, a standard measure described in neutral language that carried quiet weight. He was instructed not to discuss the incident with colleagues outside official interviews. The silence that followed was not protective. It was isolating. Internal Affairs opened a formal inquiry. The timeline was reconstructed minute by minute. Every instruction, every response, the repeated claim of smelling narcotics became a focal point. Investigators compared the statement against prior stops logged by the same officer. The pattern emerged quickly. In the previous 18 months, the officer had cited the same justification in 43 traffic stops. In 39 of those cases, no narcotics were found. In 27, the drivers were black. The numbers were not framed emotionally in the report. They did not need to be. The federal agency involved filed its own complaint, not as retaliation but as record. The language was restrained, factual, and precise. It outlined the detention, the refusal to accept credentials initially, and the escalation despite compliance. It noted the presence of witnesses. It noted the duration. The city moved next. A civil lawsuit was filed within 3 months. The settlement conference did not last long. The footage spoke for itself. The city agreed to pay $875,000 in damages, allocated between unlawful detention and violation of civil rights. No admission of wrongdoing was included in the settlement language. The amount rendered that unnecessary. Policy revisions followed. Mandatory retraining on probable cause. Enhanced supervision for discretionary stops. A requirement that claims based on sensory detection be corroborated or immediately reviewed by a supervisor. Each change was announced quietly, buried in departmental updates. The officer resigned before termination paperwork was finalized. The resignation letter cited personal reasons. The department accepted it without comment. His name was removed from active rosters. His file remained. State prosecutors reviewed the case separately. The question was narrow. Had the officer knowingly falsified probable cause statements? The answer, supported by patterns and testimony, was yes. Charges were filed for filing false reports and deprivation of rights under color of law. The plea deal came months later. 2 counts. No prison time but a suspended sentence and 3 years probation. Permanent decertification as a law enforcement officer. A $25,000 fine. The loss of pension eligibility. None of it unfolded publicly at first. There were no press conferences. No statements of regret. Just records, updated and archived. For the man who had been detained, the outcome was procedural as well. He returned to work. He testified when required. He declined interviews. His role in the story remained unchanged. He had not raised his voice. He had not forced accountability. He had simply insisted on it. And the system, slow and resistant, had eventually caught up. What followed made it difficult to describe the incident as an exception. During the internal review, auditors were instructed to widen their scope. Not just this stop. Not just this officer. The question shifted from what happened to why it was allowed to happen repeatedly. Complaint records told a consistent story. Over a 5-year period, the department had received dozens of informal grievances tied to discretionary traffic stops along the same corridor. Many were dismissed early. Language like officer discretion and subjective indicators appeared frequently in closure summaries. None of the complaints had triggered sustained monitoring. Bodycam audits revealed similar encounters. Calm drivers, vague justifications, long pauses filled with repetition rather than progress. The same claim surfaced again and again. Odor detection without corroboration. In most cases, nothing was found. The stops ended quietly. No reportable outcome meant no further scrutiny. Supervisors had signed off on those encounters as routine. The paperwork was technically complete. The boxes were checked. Procedure on paper had been followed. Training materials emphasized de-escalation, but performance metrics rewarded activity. Stops, searches, field interviews. Officers who generated numbers were viewed as proactive. Those numbers were rarely examined for quality, only quantity. The department's own data, when finally compiled, showed a disparity that could no longer be ignored. Black drivers were stopped at nearly twice the rate of white drivers in the same patrol zones, despite no corresponding increase in contraband recovery. The disparity had been visible for years. It had simply never been prioritized. Oversight committees reviewed the findings months later. Their conclusions were restrained but direct. The problem was not one officer acting independently. It was a system that treated unchecked discretion as professionalism and treated complaints as administrative noise. None of this required speculation. It was documented, timestamped, filed. The stop involving the federal agent did not introduce new information. It introduced visibility. What had once been contained within internal systems was now intersecting with external authority, with agencies that documented everything and forgot nothing. Only then did the process accelerate. Policies changed not because harm had occurred, but because exposure had. Accountability did not arrive when civilians complained. It arrived when documentation crossed institutional boundaries. That distinction mattered, because it clarified something the system had long avoided confronting. The mechanisms that failed here had been functioning exactly as designed. The outcome of this encounter was never determined by volume, anger, or confrontation. It was determined by records, by timestamps, by the quiet accumulation of decisions made under the assumption that they would never be questioned. Nothing about the stop was extraordinary on its own. An officer relied on discretion. A justification was asserted without challenge. Time was used as leverage. Compliance was demanded, not requested. These were familiar elements, repeated daily in places where authority was assumed to be sufficient explanation. What changed here was not behavior. It was context. The man in the driver's seat did not interrupt the process. He followed it. He did not escalate. He waited. He allowed the system to expose itself through repetition. Every unanswered question, every delayed response, every unsupported claim remained on record. The power imbalance did not collapse because it was challenged. Collapsed because it was documented. Accountability arrived slowly, almost reluctantly. Not because the conduct was unclear, but because systems rarely correct themselves unless compelled to do so. The same procedures that protected authority when it went unchecked became instruments of consequence once external verification entered the frame. The officer did not lose his career in a moment. He lost it across transcripts, reports, and comparisons that revealed a pattern too consistent to defend. The institution did not reform out of outrage. It adjusted under pressure when exposure made inaction costly. This is how authority fails most often. Not in dramatic acts, but in routine ones. Not through overt malice, but through confidence that procedure alone is justification enough. And this is where the story settles. If this encounter had ended differently, it would have disappeared into a database, indistinguishable from dozens of others. If the man had not known the system, had not insisted on clarity, had not been verifiable, the outcome would have been logged as routine. That is the quiet truth beneath the resolution. If this happened to someone with power, with credentials, with institutional backing, consider how often it ends without consequence for those without any of it. Not because the system is broken, but because, for a long time, it worked exactly this way.